chapters. Forest elders breathe their last. I'll bring them for your supper.
Hey y'all, it's Kelly and welcome to the Ground Shots podcast. So this episode of the podcast is going to be a little bit different than any other episode I've ever done. It's just going to be me here today talking to you. I've published a little over 50 episodes at this point and have yet to do an episode that's just me. So in this episode today, I'm going to just talk about the story behind the Ground Shots project and podcast, and also where I hail from and a little bit of my story of how I ended up where I am right now doing this. A lot of folks have wondered about that, and you might have gleaned a little bit in the episode, different bits and pieces about me. Usually when I'm interviewing people that I've known for a while, we get pretty candid about certain things. Otherwise, I haven't told my story, and I probably won't tell my full story here because it's just so much to say. I'm also going to answer some questions that folks have asked me. I put a post out on Instagram asking if people had anything they wanted me to talk about here on the podcast. I'm going to weave them in and out because some of them are pretty relevant to me telling a little bit about the project, the story, how I navigate my life. I'm really excited to answer some of these questions, and others are definitely a little bit more edgy for me, so I'll try my best. I might not get to all of them in a timely way here. Hopefully in the future I can do this again and answer more questions from y'all. I also decided to create a Google Voice number for this podcast, and I'm going to put it in the show notes of this episode because I would like to hear from people their thoughts about the podcast and where they are and what they've been listening to and what they've been getting out of it, and hopefully publish some of those on the podcast here and there. I'm hearing other podcasts do that, and I really think it's fun to hear from the audience. I get messages on Instagram, sometimes I get emails, and I get reviews on iTunes too. I want to hear more verbally from y'all and also share it with other people who listen to the podcast. In the show notes for this episode, I've attached that Google Voice number. I've never done this before, so hopefully it works right. I have a voicemail set up there. You can leave me a voicemail and I will listen and hopefully attach some of those to future episodes. So I'm actually going to get started with one of the questions that someone posed to me. And the question is, what is the origin story of where this all began and what motivated you to begin the podcast? So for context, you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, right? And the podcast is a part of a bigger project that I've been working on for a while called the Ground Shots Project. So before I actually explain to you the origin story of the podcast and then the bigger project behind the podcast, I'm going to take a couple steps back and tell you a little bit about where I came from and how I ended up in the place where these things entered into my life. So I grew up in Southern Virginia. I meet people traveling and they're like, is that Roanoke? Is that Virginia Beach? I'm like, no, it's in the middle. It's south of Richmond. They're like, but isn't that Roanoke? I'm like, no. Is it Charlottesville? No. South Hill, Virginia is the tiny little town in Southern Virginia where I grew up. And it's this tucked away little town that a lot of people have never heard of unless you drive the interstate regularly from Richmond, Virginia to Raleigh, North Carolina. You maybe see the exit sign for South Hill. And my accent is definitely a lot less extreme now that I've been on the road and living in different places. And also, honestly, it's been a survival thing. People didn't really understand what I was saying when I first went to college. And there was a time period where I was purposefully trying to alter my accent so that people took me seriously because where I'm from, the accent's really strong. And it comes out when I talk to other Southerners or my parents, and there's certain words I say that are really, I can never change. Like I call my dad deity. It's just, I can't call him daddy. Sounds very Massachusetts to me, and I'm not from there. I'm from Virginia, so I don't know if that's like a particular thing to where I come from, but I do know other people say that too. My dad ran a nursery business. So he sold plants, he had greenhouses, And that business was started actually by my grandmother, his mother and father, but my grandmother was really the mastermind behind it in the late 50s, early 60s, I think. So I grew up around plants and greenhouses and people propagating things and soil. My grandmother was really into doing everything herself as much as she could. So she did a lot of seed starting and root divisions and really didn't want to buy wholesale plants to then resell. She really tried to do as much as she could in-house. So as a kid, my sister and I spent a lot of time there helping her and playing around the property that the nursery was on. It's a couple acres, kind of on the edge of the small town where I grew up. And it's sort of this place that is next to a soybean field, but also next to a gas station, but also like 3 miles from the high school that I went to. So I would pass it every day going to school. So it's kind of this area that's rural, but not. And that business ran for a long time, and it was a big part of my life for a really long time. This town, I think, is like 4,000 people maybe in town limits. And then there's a lot of people who live in tiny little towns outside of this town that are really just a post office and gas station type places. A big part of my life was going to my grandmother's house, which was in this little mini town called Union Level, which is not really a town anymore. It used to be back when tobacco farming was a bigger industry than it is currently. And my grandparents' farm was still only like 5 miles outside of town. Tobacco farming is still the main identity of that area, but really since my grandparents' heyday, it's not as much a big part of the culture as it used to be, and that's definitely been a big kind of economic crisis in the place where I grew up. This monocrop that really was a huge part of this part of Virginia's economy for so long and depended on either enslaved labor or enslavement of the land. It's like a whole topic I could get into, but there's a lot that went into why that isn't what's happening there anymore, and that's not really the conversation I'm going to talk about now because it's like a lot of politics. But that was a big part of life there for a really long time, and a lot of people homesteaded, grew a lot of food, and raised animals on the land, and people just stayed at home and farmed. And when I was growing up, my grandparents were still doing that, and I'm 33 years old, so it really wasn't that long ago. They were still growing tobacco, they still grew food, and they had not been doing certain things for a while, like they didn't have a milking cow anymore, they didn't have chickens anymore. My mom went right back to work pretty much soon after I was born. I don't really quite remember when, but most of my childhood memories of daily life were at my grandparents' farm. My mom would take me there, and I would hang out with my grandma a lot in the house and around the farm, and my grandpa would be working in the fields. And a lot of my visceral sort of experiences growing up were hanging out with my grandma. We would be canning. We would be out in the garden. She would let me do these weird, crazy art projects in her dining room. A lot of stuff with yarn, like her crochet yarn. She did what she could with crocheting and lace work and things like that. She had all this yarn around, and I would wrap it around everything and tie it to things, and I would just create this giant maze of string and paper and all kinds of stuff in her dining room. She would let me do this. She built me these doll houses out of like all kinds of recycled newspaper magazine. She loved those tabloid magazines, so there'd be like Leonardo DiCaprio in my dollhouse. It was always a fun place to be. She always encouraged my artistic side, and as a kid, my mom too, they just knew I was a creative kid, so they always threw crayons at me and stuff. So my life growing up for a long time was there, and honestly, when I stopped going there regularly, it was kind of hard for me emotionally because my mom felt like it was too much for my grandma, I think, after a while. And then my sister was young, and she didn't want to have to put both of us onto my grandma every day. I felt a really strange feeling of disconnect after that, like just this uncomfortable, unsafe feeling after I wasn't going there anymore. I think talking about my grandparents' farm and my relationship with my grandmother is an important part of my story because my relationship with being on the land is influenced by that experience, and feeling comforted by being cared for. It's really startling to really actually see in this world that there are so many people that don't have that grandparent connection that I had growing up. And where I grew up, I had connection to my dad's parents and my mom's parents in the same place. At least all my great grandmothers were around until I was a teenager. 3 of them lived to over 100. I tell people that. I'm like, does that happen anymore? I just feel really blessed in that way that I got such a rich familial experience growing up. And as an adult, it's been kind of hard to grapple with sometimes the reality that community like that isn't there for everybody. And how do I create a life where there's no way I can really recreate that in the same way? So where I grew up, there weren't a lot of things to do, to be honest. There pretty much isn't any public lands. I mean, other than a lake that's owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. It really was a place where I didn't feel like I thrived with the kind of interest that I have and the kinds of things that I wanted to learn about and explore. The high school I went to was pretty poor in some ways. It's a public school. It's pretty much the only option in that area unless you want to drive an hour to get to a private school. Gang violence and racially motivated violence was definitely a big part of the culture of the school that I went to growing up. Yet, things like the band program, which I was in, marching band and concert band, was this place where a lot of us came together despite so many of the complex nuances that were happening. The conversation around race in a small town in the South, from my perspective, could be like a whole podcast episode. So I'm going to try to not go too deep into it right here, but just know that I think a lot about this kind of thing and how I experienced that growing up and the ways in which I was totally blind as well growing up. So I have to say here that where I grew up, I ultimately had a lot of privilege, even though the area overall was generally poor by our national standards. Because my family has been there for over 5 or 6 generations, we're white settlers. I think that our ancestry is likely German and Scandinavian, Scot-Irish, and most definitely historically, many generations back, had enslaved humans as help on farms, and I benefited and still benefit from that inherited wealth, intergenerational wealth. And though, again, the area is generally impoverished, I grew up comfortably not worrying about food on the table and had a lot of privileges because of being a white person in a rural area in the South, that my family had a sort of hold on the place, you know. I did go to college and left my hometown. I went to school on the coast of Virginia, Newport News, Hampton Roads area. This experience was definitely kind of a shock because I had never lived in a city before. Growing up, even the cities closest, which were an hour and 20 minutes, we didn't really go there to do anything. So going to school in a city was depressing in some ways for me. It was really overstimulating. I've learned later in life that I have a big thing with stimulation and I need to be really careful about the environments that I put myself in and how I deal with stimulation. Newport News is a huge military complex. They build like nuclear bombs there and stuff. It's crazy. And my school was not that far from where all that stuff was happening. But what was my saving grace was like the friends that I met there and also the park that was next to the school that was actually just more like a big wooded preserve. To be honest, where I grew up was actually a lot more diverse than living in Newport News, Virginia. Where I grew up, everyone went to school together, whether you were Latino or black or white. And when I went to college, it was pretty white and mostly kids from cities in Northern Virginia. So it was kind of an odd experience. I'd never really been around people like that. And yet it was just a lot of the same kinds of people in that school. But I had a really good college experience overall. I feel really grateful for having been able to come out of a place where a lot of my peers weren't university educated. My world was opened up when I went to school because I felt like I was pretty sheltered growing up where I did and got really interested in religious studies in college. Actually, I did take a couple college level religious studies classes in high school. The community college where I grew up actually did have an outpost station in my hometown, and there was a retired University of Kentucky religious studies professor that was offering Christian theology classes that I was really into and took. That led me, when I went to college, into being interested in studying religions from around the world and thought processes, and ended up majoring in philosophy and religious studies and anthropology in college. Growing up Southern Baptist in the rural South, I was super interested in why people believe what they believe and how that affects their relationship with each other and the land. I feel like I came to understand how religion as an institution functions sometimes as a social mechanism, and in other ways it really reaches people's sort of heart space of connection to something outside of themselves. But I know where I grew up, the rural churches were often the gathering places where people met up, and when they were on their land all week and not seeing other humans, it was where they came together. And a lot of the black churches where I grew up, it was the place where they could be away from white people and not deal with being observed by white people. Yet, too, those same institutions that can be gathering places seem to be tools for oppression. In college, I was really interested in esoteric philosophies around the world and the commonalities between this sort of deeper way of thinking about how we're all interconnected to the greater universe. I was really wanting to find bridges of commonality, which is something I still feel like I'm looking for more than differences in a world where the differences are always highlighted more. To me, it seems like a lot of the philosophy classes I took and the teachers I had, that was their goal too. We're studying this because we're trying to understand the way people think, why they believe things so wholeheartedly, and how this informs the way they relate to the world. And looking for the ways that we can find commonality through studying spiritual belief and the philosophy of those spiritual beliefs, I think is an important thing to really understand the kind of bare bones of what informs our world and why we make rules, why we decide what's right and wrong, why we decide to act in certain situations and not. One professor that I had that really influenced me, his name was Kip Reddick, or Hippie Kippy. He took students out on the Appalachian Trail every spring. A lot of these students had never been on a trip like that, and they backpacked for a couple weeks. And he got them to write papers on their experience of living out of a backpack out on the lands. He's done this for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, and has compiled these stories of people's experiences. He told a lot of stories in his classes because before he was a professor, he hitchhiked around and lived very simply out in the so-called wilderness and lived this very transient, simple life, and had a lot of things happen during that time, and decided to go get his PhD in religious studies later on in life. But his stories really brought richness to his classes, and his relatability as a professor that would wear his Hawaiian shirt to class and maybe be barefoot sometimes was something that really stuck with me. And I think a lot of students just really loved him, no matter where the student came from. It could have been a rich kid from the suburbs or someone from the country, or really any walk of life. I feel like people just love this teacher, and he's still a teacher at this school, and I'm hoping at some point I can get him on the podcast. I haven't asked him yet, but we do keep in touch, especially talking about a couple philosophies to me that are really important, that I really would love to share with the world more. Martin Buber is one philosopher that I would love to speak about more, especially when looking at what nature is and what we see as living and not living, and how we understand how we're relating with the land. When I was in college, I walked the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage in Spain. It starts generally on the border of France and Spain, but there's actually a bunch of different caminos that start all over Europe traditionally and come together at a couple main veins in Spain, and then in sort of near the coast of Spain, just north of Portugal. I did this walk with Kip and a handful of other students. it was pretty life-changing for me. About 500 miles. I met a lot of different people from all over the world. Kip had us interview people, talk to people, and do our own journaling just like he would do on the Appalachian Trail. And I wrote a whole lot. It really solidified a practice for me of writing through spiritual experience. Whether I was having a hard day or a good day, I tried to write what I could, what I was experiencing, what the land looked like, what stories I had heard that day, what I was feeling about the connections I had made. I'm sharing this with you too, in part to also explain another influence on my life, this professor and this experience on the Camino. And it started my interest in storytelling and also land observation through direct experience, being on foot. Especially, you experience so many visceral things. That's something that really stuck with me on the Camino, was when you're on foot for a whole month. You smell things, you hear things, you feel things, the temperature changes, the pollen in the air, the flowers, and even see the signs of poison on the land. There were signs that said, don't drink this water because it's poisoned. And when you're in a car, you're numb to what it really means to traverse on land and witness it in all of your body's ability to witness it. I became interested in ecology in college as a result of looking at the problems of our society. To be honest, philosophy breaks down your world. It makes you question what you always thought you knew. And so living in this weird nuclear bomb building complex that was Hampton Roads, and studying how our world is built on the commodification of every living thing, and how we as humans have messed up in so many ways and have thrived in other ways. And leaving college around the time that the economic depression happened, it was 2009 when I graduated college, being left with the sense of, how do I become a cog in the wheel after learning everything that I've learned? And there was definitely some resources out there I didn't know about at the time, but what I chose to do was go work on organic farms, and I decided to do this in New Hampshire. While I lived in New Hampshire, I really had an eye-opening experience of connecting with the land in a way I never have, because there's a lot of forest up there and a lot of preserves and places to hike and walk and be on the land. And I hadn't experienced that in Newport News so much, or where I grew up. Being able to walk through hemlock forests that were so majestic, you could lay under them and take naps. And I was just in awe at the forest. And I worked a lot on this farm. It was like insane how much I worked on this farm. And it was completely opposite than my college experience. I went from intellectualizing everything all the time to being in the dirt every day and doing hard manual labor. And any free time I had, I'd walk in the forest or the fields and sit with the plants. I ended up studying with an herbalist up there, Rebecca Golden, through a series of circumstances, and I worked with her on the weekends while I worked at the farmer's market and on this farm during the weekdays, and really learned a lot about plants. Even though I had grown up at my parents' nursery and my grandparents' farm, I felt disconnected from the seasonality of life. So I really got in tune with that there and ended up spending some winters up there living off grid. That was also a really big experience for me, kind of throwing myself into rustic life, what it means to chop your own wood and haul your own water and not be able to drive to your house. After that, I spent a summer living in Southeast Ohio at the United Plant Savers Golden Seal Sanctuary and studied with folks like Paul Strauss and Chip Carroll. And then eventually made my way to Asheville, North Carolina, where I went to herbalism school with Juliette Blancospore in the Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine back when it was an in-person program. And Juliette did a lot of projects out on the land in the field and had a medicinal herb nursery, which was really cool for me growing up in a nursery environment, seeing how she cultivated plants that were edible or medicinal. It was in Asheville that I was introduced to the work of the late ethnobotanist Frank Cook. I think especially from Mark Williams, who's a local ethnobotanist in that area. And Frank traveled all over the world. I think he wanted to meet like every genus of plant. And he seemed to be able to seamlessly connect together plants from different places and bring it back to the places that he called home, which were often multiple. Because at this point in my time in North Carolina and in California, I have found other people who knew him and places where he taught plant walks, and he left a trail of his work all over. And his ability to take that knowledge and then put it together in a way that created such a well-rounded, holistic view on our connection to the land and ecology itself, and how every place where we are has tendrils and connections to every other place. And, Latin names are this one way of speaking about plants, and often they are used to talk about how certain plants are closely related to one another, or maybe groups of plants in, say, a certain genus or species, or a certain species of plant may like the same conditions. There's a lot of ways that we can use language and we can use observations to understand how plants might be in commonality with one another. And I really just appreciated how Frank did this. I ended up living in Asheville, North Carolina for a few years and staying on a farm, living off-grid in community. I ran a small little CSA and really experimented with growing herbs and food in different spots on the farm, and really made some great friends in that area that are still really good friends of mine today, and really learned about other ways of being in family with people. After a couple seasons farming and not making a whole ton of money selling lettuce mix and fresh herbs, a friend of mine actually reached out to me who had been caretaking a farm in Northern California, a marijuana farm, and she said that they would have winter work if I would like it. So after my season was done, around the end of October, early November in North Carolina, I went to Northern California for the winter, and I had never really traveled west before that. And it really blew my mind getting out of my comfort zone and hitting the road. I drove cross country with some people, and I started this cyclical kind of seasonal journey of going west for a couple winters. And I had actually been going to New Hampshire for the winters before that. So I kind of always have been living this seasonal life, even when I would spend 6 months running the farm and then the winter somewhere else. It just switched from going to New Hampshire to work at a Nordic ski center to going to Northern California to work on a marijuana farm. And over time, I started to be nomadic more and farm less. I did come back to that farm a lot over the years in North Carolina, even when I wasn't running the vegetable gardens. And I really appreciate that place as sort of a place I could always land. Moving across what was at the time unfamiliar landscapes still had me searching for familiarity, and even all across the country traveling, I seemed to find plant friends. Like, I swear yarrow grows everywhere. And the movement that started to happen at this time for me really became this experience of almost being a child born again, learning new plants and new landscapes and trying to comprehend what I was experiencing based on what I had learned in Appalachia and also in New England, since I lived there before going west. So I was really interested in connecting together the different ecologies I was experiencing, and also through this experience realized that there's no clear divides between place. Ultimately, there's always some tendril that connects one place to another. And for a time, I really just wanted to witness and explore that and be able to take in all of those interconnections. Someone else asked me a question about connecting to place being in one place versus connecting to places being on the road or always moving or being in different places. I have a lot of thoughts about that. One being, people traditionally were nomadic a lot historically and lived in different camps seasonally throughout the year that were often very far apart. And that's been my life at times where I'm in a camp that's based around food and then also having to work and things like that too. But it's not that I don't experience the same places over and over. I often go back to places I really love to see them in different times of the year. It's that it's a different experience than being in one place and never leaving. I think about that a lot growing up where I did, where I also know people who literally have never left my hometown. And I think that there's something unhealthy about that too, never leaving. But also, there's something special you gain from being in one place and seeing it spiral, the story of that place layer upon itself. There are tools that I found that I used all over traveling and found a sense of home with the plants on the land in so-called nature through the discovery of these plants. Even if I didn't know their names, if you believe in things like Saturn returns, it was around the time of that, uprooting from how I as an individual was in a role in a community as a farmer, and then leaving that sense of purpose and being out on the road and taking seasonal jobs and spending a lot more time with plants in remote areas. I had to really peel away some layers of who I thought I was. And there were really hard times. Sometimes I felt like, what is my purpose? What am I doing? It would be these drastic times of working on marijuana farms where I'd just be sitting 15 hours a day. The work is not glamorous, And I wanted to be honest about that too, because, back when I first started doing that seasonal work, it was something that you really didn't want to talk about publicly. But at this point, with marijuana being practically on the edge of national legality, I feel it's important to share how a lot of people manage to live alternative lifestyles because of seasonal work like that, which used to pay a bit more and now it's a lot less, and it allowed a sense of freedom the rest of the year to have enough money saved to do a little bit. It's still not a whole lot of money in the bigger scheme of what our culture sees as a lot of money, but for me, it allowed me to spend time on the land the rest of the year. But honestly, it was really hard on my spirit to do that work. A lot of winters in weird, moldy RVs, working for weird people, and also being still a part of the extraction economy of marijuana in order to then do this work I felt was really important. I was always dreaming of where I could go in the summer and what I could see and learn and explore and record and experience and connect together. My brain seems to be able to spiderweb these places and ideas and people and experiences together in a way that is not quite linear, but interconnected and spiraled together. So I felt like I was on a journey of giving myself the ability to do that. So the Ground Shots project started off as an art project of sorts, as well as a kind of ecological study based on my experience of the teachings of Frank Cook, the ethnobotanist that I mentioned earlier. I wanted to record and learn plants in different lands and landscapes and understand how they were connected to one another and not divided by these arbitrary lines that we tend to draw on ecosystems. Being a creative person, too, I can get really intellectual about things, but I also find that often poetry and artwork, color, shapes, communicate something that intellectual communication doesn't. And I did a walking studio project with this organization called Signal Fire. It's an art and ecology program, basically, and it helped me channel my work of ecological study on the land into an art practice. I did a month-long trip with them in the Pacific Northwest where we studied the stories of the coyote and the stories of colonization of that land and the stories of the Nimapu people up there and how that's connected to the landscape. It really changed my perspective on how I do what I do and how important story is and the importance of art as a mechanism for social change. So someone else asked me a question about whether I'll ever publish my work. And when I first started the Ground Shots project, I put out a few zines, and I was really inspired at first by putting out poetry and photography and writing on the land as a way to communicate emotive ideas, not just like, here's what's happening, here's why you should care. The impressions that I felt, I wanted to somehow share, and it was less direct. You know, one of the poems in my first zine was a reflection on the squaring of land and nature, and I saw that pattern in both Nevada and also in my garden practice in North Carolina. In the capitalist world that I found myself in, and I still find myself in, you go to the store, everything's in a box. Practically everything is square. And my curiosity as to why we squared everything, you know, and moving across the land and observing how the ecologies of the land were connected. I also observed the social environment and what the towns look like, the colors of the towns, the way the people talked. I couldn't help but also try to see the way that as humans we're connected through our stories. As far as publishing, I have had a couple publishing projects sort of in the works and in my thoughts for a while now. One of them is a compilation of writings that I've never put out in the world that I wrote on the road for all these years. And hopefully at some point I will get that out. I think the slowing down that I've been doing, which I'm really appreciative of right now, and COVID has been also a pressure to do less and stay in one place more, at least share my energy among just a couple places instead of everywhere, has allowed me to focus in on pulling together some of that work and also reflecting deeply on my experiences traveling a lot the past 7 years. So the plant profiles I've written on my website, which you may or may not know about, but they're these deeply exploratory writings that visit a plant or a genus of plants and how those plants in that genus are interconnected and how cultures are interconnected to those plants together and how the medicine or food quality of those plants are connected to human culture and geography. It's really been an awesome journey exploring that with those plants. At some point, maybe I will put that in a book form, or maybe I will create a course with some of those and expand on them, or create a course with a whole other set of plant profiles in the same style and energy. Something I will be working on this winter with my partner, Gabe Crawford, who's been on the podcast a couple times. We hiked the Colorado Trail this summer, traditional Ute land, and a lot of the trail follows old Ute trails. We did a big project of observing wild gardens and the archaeological remnants embodied through plants of wild gardens of traditional indigenous peoples who tended these lands. And we planted some of the seeds back of some of those same plants or their very close relatives, and did a lot of note taking as well on the modern cultural impact on the land. In our hope this winter is to put together some sort of zine that uses that experience as a map for looking at the land in a different way, understanding how our experiences as humans are connected to how we look at lands. And this walk will be an inspiration for that zine. We'll go into different areas we walk through and sort of the history of those areas and some of the different issues that come up in those areas as you walk through them. So we hope to finish that this winter and put it out in the spring. We have been really deep in the throes of research right now that's not fully connected to that project, but it's really something that we want to digest and put together and hopefully publish this coming year. So look out for that. So the podcast started as an idea while I was working on one of those marijuana farms with a group of friends, all of them very gifted people. We would tell stories while we work. I also would stay with people on the road. I'd end up in these places with people I never thought I would be around. And often when I would do this work, I would reflect on the people I had met and the stories I had heard. And I felt like suddenly I really wanted to start a project where I captured stories in some form, or at least captured conversations where people shared their thoughts and feelings. And with the land being the common denominator, for me, it seems like it just inherently has to be. All of the stories that I was interested in had that as a thing that brought us all together. The idea came to me that just like how plants are all interconnected and animals and the soil and the land, we as humans, which are nature, our stories and our experiences are all connected in some form. And again, the land, which is what makes us be at all, is the common denominator. It was a challenge for me at first because I have definitely been a very shy person in the past. Being the center of attention is really hard, hence why I haven't done a solo episode until now. And putting myself out there in that way really was scary, but I just went for it. And I have to also owe a lot of thanks to Heather of Opia Creative, because we had been online friends and then we met in person in Point Reyes, staying at a hostel. Point Reyes is a really beautiful place on the coast of California. And I just talked to her about this idea. And she's like, well, I'm a sound engineer and I can help you get it going. And I would love to help you get it going. It sounds like an amazing idea. Let's do it. And so we did. And she's been working with me until now. So at this point, I've also answered in some ways a question someone posed to me about how I financially make my life work. I haven't really paid rent since I was in college. I'm 33 years old. So that's an expense that I save. And I've lived really simply. I, for a while, lived in a backpack, shared a car at times with my past partner. We lived together in a truck at one point, and then I had my own truck with a shell in the back, and I had a bed in it, and I lived in that for a while. And then at some point, I got the camper that I have now that is definitely a lot nicer than just a shell in the back. And it's pretty small space. It's really small. That saved me a lot of money, being able to have my own space and also be able to move between worlds and spend time on the land. It allowed me that access, and it didn't cost me a lot of money to create the space itself. I really lucked out in finding something that was affordable, and then I added solar power to the camper and added other little pieces and parts to it to make it fit my needs. And the work on the marijuana farms has been a big part of my income. It hasn't been a ton of money, but it's what's kept this project afloat, to be honest. And I started a Patreon a couple years ago, back when I first started the Ground Shots project, and it has definitely also been a part of the funding of this project. I've definitely done other things for money, including teaching some of my skills, plant walks, hide tanning, and doing some landscaping work with different friends who will offer me work whenever I come to town. So I've definitely diversified my options at times, but I would like to get away from doing the seasonal marijuana work because I feel like it ultimately stifles my creativity and my focus on this project. Another question that someone posed to me was, how did you fall in love with plants? I think my time living in New Hampshire really solidified that for me, even though I grew up around plants with my family's nursery business. I think the smell of the environment at the nursery, the smell of dirt and leaves really stuck with me, to be honest. And when I lived in New Hampshire and I got to walk around in those beautiful forests and studied with the herbalist up there that I studied with, it kind of set my life in that trajectory of really being interested in herbal medicine and ethnobotany and land tending techniques and that space between farming and wildness. I think it started there. So here's a logistical question that someone posed to me. What kind of camera do you use and how do you edit your photos? So in my travels, I've done a lot of photographic documentation as well as artwork and writing and recording stories and doing research. Sometimes my research is also using my photography skills. For a while, I had this old camera that I had had since high school, actually until this spring. It was a Canon Rebel, like one of those that when you look it up on eBay, the camera body itself is worth like less than $50. And I had a bunch of lenses that I accumulated over the years for it. And so when I would travel, I would use that camera for the most part to photograph people in the land. It served me quite well for a while. I finally replaced it after 15 years of having this camera this past spring. But before that, I also used a film camera sometimes, and some of my photographs I use on my website and on my Instagram are actually analog from a vintage camera, a Pentax. I played around with film on the road too for years. So some of my photography is just straight film and not really edited at all. Recently, I have been photographing with a Panasonic G85, which is a mirrorless camera. Mirrorless cameras can use old camera lenses, like from analog cameras, which is not something I could do with my Canon Rebel, which was a DSLR, if you know anything about cameras. But I do sometimes use vintage camera lenses on the Panasonic, but generally I just have one pancake lens that I use a lot. Some of my photography is just iPhone photography. I use Adobe Lightroom. I edit with Visco filters. They have a free app for iPhone photography editing, and then you can buy their filters for use in Adobe Lightroom, and you buy them one time and then it goes into your Lightroom program. And I use some of their filters and then tweak them and alter them a little bit. I kind of have my own style, how I want my photos to look a lot of the time, but sometimes I just don't edit them and post them. So it's a little bit of everything, of being particular and then not particular, and using film and a fancy camera sometimes. But I get really into photography, especially photographing plants. Actually, on the Colorado Trail, I used a couple Moment lenses. It's a company in California that makes little lenses for iPhones that are really nice. And I especially used a macro lens of theirs to take really close-up shots of plants. So another question that someone posed to me was, what have been some of the most memorable smells on your wanderings? And man, that is a hard one to answer because there's so many smells that I have in my body memory. But I'd say that traveling through Nevada and smelling the sagebrush during rain and snow has definitely been one of the more memorable experiences that I have had. There's something about the scent of that plant in that place that makes me feel like I'm time traveling, that I don't even know what time is anymore, and that I'm connecting to something ancient and beyond my own life and lifetime. So another question was, has art and ecology always been an intersection for you? And actually, I would say no, because as a young person who did a lot of art, I did a lot of painting and crafts growing up. I was really into painting and color, and a lot of my artwork had nothing to do with plants, at least in my conscious mind, or the land and ecology. But as I got older, I do think it evolved more into a way to capture the emotionalness and impression of the intersection of culture and ecology that I was experiencing. I didn't really know how to articulate that sometimes in words, but I could paint what I was feeling. And often my artwork has literally just been catharsis for me. So another question is, how do you envision your life long term? Would you be happy with nomadism, semi-nomadism, or a focus on one region? I would say that I would love to have a home base. I really haven't had too much of a home base over the years. I had a partner for a while that was based in the Sierra foothills of California, and I would come back to that area a lot, but I never really felt like I had a home there. I really haven't felt like I've had a home in a long time, other than the home in myself on the land and with plants. That's been my home, but I would love to have a physical home where I can have quiet space and focus on projects that require a regularity of environment, something that I really thrive from, to be honest. A lot of the years of moving have really worn my nervous system, while also I gained a lot of wisdom and knowledge from those experiences. I would like to have more time in one place, and then also have space in my life to go on trips and adventures and do food camps in different places, or go on walks like the walk I did this summer with Gabe. So I want to find a balance between those two things. So I guess I would say place-based with some occasional semi-nomadism. I'm definitely leaning into what it feels like to have more of a consistent space of my own after many years of being someone else's guest or just being out in the wilds. Another question that someone asked me is, what are some daily rituals that keep you sane? Well, a lot of my time on the road, I did not really have very good rituals, to be honest. When I lived on the farm in North Carolina, I definitely had a good morning routine, waking up and stretching and meditating, and I'd go on a bike ride or run out in the mountains and walk on the farm early in the morning with my coffee or tea and just look at everything. I loved seeing the plants I was tending incrementally change every day. That's something that I haven't been able to experience living on the road. There's a magic to that tending and seeing a seed turn into this living being. A lot of my morning routine used to be to walk around and visit with all my plant friends and see, what groundhog was digging where and what birds were hugging what trees and that kind of thing. And I actually do that when I'm in different environments. I try to get up early and take walks, smell the air and look at things and observe. That's really helpful for me. I do always make some sort of coffee in the morning, and to me, honestly, it's like been the most regular thing living on the road, even though drinking too much coffee can be bad for the nervous system. It was something that I felt like I could do anywhere. Of course, I could also meditate anywhere, and I did not keep that practice up. And stretching in my camper when it's really cold out is pretty hard because there's not enough floor space to do yoga, so sometimes that fell to the wayside. I like to run and get a lot of exercise, and that, honestly, when I keep that up, I feel so good because I can be such a mental person, and also being in my body through some sort of movement really helps ground me and helps me think clearly and be settled into my emotional self as well. So the last question I'm going to answer on air today is, can settlers morally own or tend land? My thoughts on this are complex and multifaceted, and I'm ultimately not the one that has the end-all answer on this, but I feel like we have a moral obligation to tend land appropriately and consciously, and to participate in ecology the way that humans are supposed to. Nature is not an object that never changes, and the way that ecology morphs and changes over time is often in direct reaction to how humans tend land. And the situation we're in now is that a lot of land has been not cared for based on a philosophical basis of land is unliving and has no beingness and can be used to extract and capitalize on, and that is the basis of settler colonial ways of thinking. Part of the harm is a lack of participation, and part of the harm is over disturbance. So I think that tending land is vitally important. Tending land based on past practices by indigenous peoples that we've learned from that have actually affected the way the plants grow is really important, but also we need to take kind of stock of what are our current issues of today that are unique to today and figure out how to tend appropriately. So whether that's advocating for, say, a parking lot of an abandoned mall to be broken up and turned into pollinator gardens, or whether that's advocating for the median that runs through a main thoroughfare in a city to be replaced with wildflowers or trees that are habitat for birds, or whether that means tearing up your own lawn and planting a garden or native plants, or whether that means spending time tending plants and ecologies on public land. I honestly don't really like that narrative that as settlers we shouldn't touch the land, because that's part of the problem. We're seeing that narrative because of the fact that so many people are horrified by how much settler colonial practices have harmed the land. But, you know, all of us who are settlers, which we all come from different ancestries that had a land-based tradition, we have it in our ancestry to care for the land and be a part of it as well. And it's important for all of us to find purpose in that, because if we don't, then the harmful practices will stay the normal. That's the thing that I find important, that if we all start to participate in some form, wherever we are, then it'll change incrementally the mainstream modern cultural practices that are seen as normal, like growing tens of thousands of acres of potatoes where camas should be, and literally injecting herbicides and fungicides into the groundwater in order to be able to successfully grow these potatoes. If we don't tend the camas and we don't find it culturally important, then we will continue to see these practices happen en masse. I'd like to read a quote to y'all from a book I've been reading by Tal Ryan called Beyond the War on Invasive Species. Quote, "One of the best ways to ensure the health of native plant communities is to use them. Native ecosystems are more than just aggregations of plants and animals. They are remnant agro-ecosystems that have evolved through thousands of years of stewardship and engagement. Pantries stocked with cornmeal, cattail flour, camas bulb cakes, and water lotus seeds would necessitate landscapes where these species proliferate. Insulation made of rushes would make wetlands critical features of home comfort. Saving native ecosystems has everything to do with placing importance on their survival, not as intellectually important vestiges of what used to be, but as vital resources that are integrated into our day-to-day lives." End quote. So if we do not make native plants important in mainstream culture as a part of our lives, then we will not care about tending them, and we will not care about their survival ultimately. This does not mean that land tending is just taking without thinking about the reciprocity of our actions. Appropriate tending always has reciprocity in mind. Another quote that inspires this thinking by Tal Ryan, quote, "Native plants aren't just native to a place. They are essential elements of a culture that stewards them. Many native species depend on human use for their proliferation. Native species like milkweed, echinacea, trillium, bloodroot, dwarf trout lily, biscuit root, elderberry, bitterroot, huckleberry, hickory, water lily, and cat's claw, as well as countless others, are not merely native plants or just simply wildflowers. They are food, medicine, fiber, shelter, tools, and a biological legacy." And here's the last quote I'll include in reference to this question by Tal Ryan. Quote, "The value in cultivating native crops and rekindling historic stewardship patterns is a critical piece of cultural revitalization as well as an acknowledgement on the part of those who learned and accepted a woefully misrepresented history of colonization. That people were intrinsic to the creation and maintenance of natural resource wealth that was so-called discovered and subsequently exploited in North America, Central America, South America, Australia, Africa, and throughout Asia. The land management models of people who have lived in a place and enhanced its biological diversity over the course of thousands of years should serve as inspiration for the new paradigm of restoration." End quote. And when it comes to private land ownership and the morality of private land ownership as a construct, I feel like ultimately private land ownership is harmful and creates hierarchy that is harmful, but we live in a world where private land ownership is pretty much imposed on every living thing that exists, including what we consider public land is privately owned by the government. And ultimately the government can decide to extract from that land if it's enough money involved. There are public land designations that allow more resource extraction, and there are other public land designations that do not. But again, ultimately the government can decide to change a designation according to what resource they could extract from that place and do what they would like with it. So I think that private land ownership in this culture is just the reality, and while it would be really awesome to get rid of that whole concept altogether, that would be really hard to implement right now in the world that we live in, especially saying that settlers should get rid of every single ounce of land that they own and give it all back to indigenous peoples. I do think that rematriation of land is vitally important right now, especially land should be given back to indigenous tribes that have no land, and especially in areas where a lot of settlers have a disproportionate amount of land compared to indigenous peoples. But with all of that said, if you are a settler that owns private land, you have a responsibility to use that land as a tool for changing our culture for the better. I ultimately believe that private land ownership is a destructive concept, but I don't think that we can just easily erase that concept from the infrastructure of our society in an instant. And I don't think that we can erase the idea that settlers or anyone can own land. But I do think that if people own land and actually steward it responsibly, it's better than a corporation owning land and putting an open pit copper mine there, or it being BLM land where the government decides that they want to put natural gas fracking wells on those pieces of land. So it's a complicated issue, and I think that it's weird that anyone owns land, but we're here. This is the world we live in, and if we own land, we should use that to tend land outside of the land that we live on. We should grow food on that land. We should responsibly connect with that land. We should talk to our neighbors and figure out how we can connect with our neighbors who share an ecological corridor with us, and figure out how we in concert can tend land together. With all that said, we'll end this conversation right here with me solo on this episode of the Ground Shots podcast. I'll do more of these on occasion, and I have a lot more pieces and parts of my story that I may share in the future as I feel like it could be appropriate or as I feel comfortable with doing that. So thanks for listening. The interstitial music for this episode was Rainbow Waltz by Cody Fielder. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was edited by me. I'm experimenting with a new editing software to see if I can do my own edits. It's been really fun and interesting to try. If you would like to support this podcast, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt. The Patreon page offers Patreon-only content that has been compiled over the last several years. It's a huge library at this point of how-tos, Patreon-only videos, Patreon-only audio content, early releases of podcast episodes, guides submitted by podcast guests, and more. If you feel compelled, that is one big way you can support this project. There are also ways you can just make a donation. The links to do that are all in the show notes. Another way that you can support the project is to give us a review on iTunes or share the podcast on your social media platform. I've compiled a bunch of relevant links that go along with this podcast episode, and you can find them all in the show notes. As I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, we now have a Google Voice number where you can call and leave us voicemails reflecting on your experiences of the podcast, and please do send us a note. Just remember, if you do call in and leave a voicemail, you are giving us permission to potentially share your note or part of your note with the audience. I would love to start doing that and see how it goes. All right, y'all. Thanks again for listening, and really appreciate you being here supporting the podcast. It's been a couple years, and it's been a long journey of podcasting on the road, and right now I'm in one place and podcasting a lot through the computer, and finding these stories and sharing them with you has been such a treat, and I really hope to continue to do this well into the future. So thanks again, and until next time, y'all.